and go. Oh, one last thing. Because we're also in Teams and you can't change how your name appears, if you would be so kind as to type your name and organization into the chat, that would really help us keep track of who's on the webinar today, because all we have is a list of names and we're not sure what organization you're affiliated with, or if you're a landowner, prairie enthusiast, we have no idea. So if you could just type your name into the chat and your organization, that would be fabulous. And again, the chat is just to the right of the two little people at the top of your screen. Look at you, Jamie. You're so good at instructions. Okay, Becky, go ahead if you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you, Megan, and thank you, everybody. My name is Becky Esser. I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in northern Minnesota, and welcome to our second installment of our Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, also known as PRI Winter Webinar Series. We're super excited to have Ian here today. Just a little bit about PRI, and I'm going to shamelessly read a little bit off of this slide here that you can see. We are a collaboration of individuals from over 30 conservation organizations throughout the upper Midwest and beyond. And our biggest focus is to build an engaged community of practice, to learn together collectively about all the phases of prairie reconstruction and how to overcome uncertainties and be more successful. And so we really feel strongly about the power of collective learning and engaging the greater community of practice. We have a small advisory team that spearheads a lot of things, such as the webinar series, etc. And you can see a list of them below, but really PRI is about our greater community of practice. All of you biologists, practitioners, researchers, private landowners, and the like, everybody learning together, and all of the work that you do and the learning that you do. And it's all about sharing. So one way is through webinars. Another really popular way is our field days. But we also have tools and products such as a database and a monitoring protocol, etc. So lots of things to do, lots of ways to learn about prairie reconstruction and how to be more successful together. I invite you to check out our website that's listed at the bottom of this slide, and please contact one of us if you're interested in learning more. Like Megan said, be on the listserv. And now I'll turn it over to Megan to introduce Ian.
Becky, for not having rehearsed that, you did a fabulous job. So I just have to say. So now we are just so grateful that Ian Lane is here in his blue room of excitement and bee knowledge. So Ian is I'm going to call him an invertebrate ecologist. You could also call him a restoration ecologist. He is a current PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and he is getting ready. He's fixing to graduate, people. He's looking for a job. So if you like this presentation, hire Ian. But so that was just for you. Ian, why don't you go ahead and jump right in?
Thank you, Megan. And I hope the Blue Room is calming rather than exciting. You know, we're like, we're all going to have like a nice time. It's not going to be crazy. But yeah, as Megan said, I am a PhD student, and essentially I'm going to be giving you an overview of like how and where my questions started and where they're kind of at the moment. And they're all revolving around the central question of how do we define conservation success when it comes to bees and prairie restorations. So I say pollinator a lot, and in my case, that usually just means bees, but I like to be inclusive. You know, there's like, that includes a lot of different things. So just know that if I say pollinator, I probably mean bees for me specifically, but in any case, bees as a group is this really big, complex group of animals that is just really awesome, and it's so amazing how complex and diverse it is, because most people don't even realize what's going on. They're part of that hidden world of diversity. You know, like most people who really all end up getting into insects really describe this moment of like, oh my God, I didn't realize like all the stuff that was going on under the microscope, you know, all the forms and colors and diversity and structures. And bees are no different. They have this huge variety of lifestyles. You know, they're solitary to social. They have these different places that they nest, different nesting materials. They forage on different types of plants, use different materials. There's even bees that harvest carcasses in the Amazon and so on. So bees as a group are incredibly diverse and span all sorts of different lifestyles. I actually think that using birds for people who don't know insects as much is not a terrible analogy. You know, there's cuckoo birds and they have different habitat affinities and different things they like to eat and different ways they make their nests. And bees aren't completely dissimilar in that regard. So one thing that I'm sure most people in the webinar are aware of is this big alarm bell that's going off about pollinator declines or bee declines, if you will. There's a number of publications, some are older, some are newer, one's really new, about this idea that we are losing pollinators. You know, there's these declines. You know, if you just look at this kind of headlines, these abstracts, you get this vague sense that something bad is happening, but it's kind of vague. There's this idea that's like, okay, here's like species richness. There's like all these other words like co-occurrence, function. It's like, so what does it all mean? Like, how does that inform like, okay, there's people are ringing alarm bells. What do we do about it? What's our action that we have to take now that there is something that seems like it's going on? So one of the big tools people have turned to is actually restoration, ecological restoration. And people have been using this to try to conserve bees. And the top left was this nice big study about just native wildflower plantings, not even prairies, you know, as a way of increasing function on farms. And then there's a number of kind of summaries of studies about how habitat restoration and grassland restorations improve or benefit wild bees. So we're getting a sense that, okay, so here's an action we can take. We can restore habitat, which is probably the number one way of conserving most animals, right? So, and bees aren't different from that. But still, the goal is a little vague. Like, what does improve and benefit mean? So I'm going to kind of take a second to break down a little bit what's going on in these. So one of the things that is going on in this summary of different studies is that restoration seemed to really benefit the abundance of bees. So regardless of regardless of species, regardless of anything else, there's just more individual bees in restorations than in some of the other reference places that they're looking. So that could mean like a field margin, a farm field, like a soybean field, an old field. And sometimes they have the other kind of comparison, the positive control, like a prairie remnant, like as maybe their other reference. So you've got kind of like a negative control and a positive control, and they're trying to compare restorations against them. So abundance, these restoration plantings, be it just a floral planting all the way up to grassland restorations, tend to really improve bee abundance. They're higher abundance in restorations, even maybe than native habitats like remnants. And they're also finding that these restorations contain comparable or even higher amounts of richness than field margins or remnants. And what richness is essentially, they looked at the number of species. It's pretty self-explanatory. So in my little hypothetical example here, there's 3 different species in the restoration. So there's 3. There's 1 in the field margin, so that's 1. Prairie remnants, there's 3 there. So restorations in this example are just as rich in species as prairie remnants and eminently richer than field margins. So this is good. Like restorations are seemingly supporting bee abundance and richness that are similar to other things that we can look at. So that seems really good, but as I was kind of beginning my PhD project, there was already some like different kinds of studies coming out that were telling us different things. Things that brought up, is this truly doing what we want it to do? And so one good example I'm going to bring up here is this study from Cameron. It's getting a little old, but back in 2011, they published a big analysis of bumblebee populations across North America. And so one of the analyses that's most relevant to us here in the Midwest and the tallgrass prairie is this one about these groups of species here at the bottom. So what I'm going to point out here is that Bombus impatiens in the center was historically, and I have the key up here, the black is 1900 to 1990, so this kind of historical level of abundance compared to more recent measures of abundance. And Bombus impatiens has really gotten more abundant over time. Something about the way things have changed in our country and across North America has really allowed them to increase in the number of individuals they have. And then you have some of these other types of species like our rusty patch bumblebee and some other species like Bombus pennsylvanicus and Bombus terricola that are at historic lows compared to some other species. So there's this idea that there's some winners and losers in this bee decline saga. It's not just, oh man, bees are tanking and they're all going under. It's not so simple. It's more like certain species are losing and others are winning. So in this example of the grassland restoration studies, where we're just thinking about abundance, I start to think, is that abundance just driven by the winners? Is the restoration just full of Bombus impatiens? Or is there something else going on? Is it actually more even? And this type of work hasn't been really done yet. And kind of on that same vein, there's another like kind of slew of work that's coming out, and I'm going to break this down, so don't worry if there's like kind of a wall of text here. Kind of hinting that humans modify the habitat in such a way that it actually promotes winners over these, well, I guess, yeah, obviously winners, it's creating winners and losers in the environment. So when you get down to things like, here's a good example from one of those research articles. They were looking at how agriculture, urban, and forest bee communities differed. So this isn't like a restoration or anything. They're just out to kind of look at how these different communities how the species composition of these communities looked. So this graph is something you'll see a lot of in my talk, so I'll try to explain it well. What this is a field, and you have different sites represented by these dots. And the closer those dots are, the more similar the species composition of those sites are. So up here, this site and this site are more similar than like this site and this site down here. So we use these types of analysis to say, hey, are the species making up certain kinds of landscapes similar or more dissimilar than others? And what they were finding is that the bees in their natural habitats, like forests, were pretty different than the ones that they found in more human type environments, like agricultural fields or urban environments. So natural area species are different than the species you find in these other more human dominated landscapes. So this is starting to tell us that maybe there's some important things going on with the types of landscapes and habitats that are out there that affect what species win and lose. And one thing that I kind of skimmed over really quick was the last piece of evidence coming out was that rare species were more likely to be in decline in these anthropogenic habitats. So what this paper did was they classified rarity based on how frequent a species was found, and found that, especially in agricultural areas, there was fewer rare species than in a more natural area like forests. So there's this idea rare species are probably way more in need of our conservation effort than other types of environments or other types of species. So this is something that's telling us our habitats aren't set up in a very good way to promote the conservation of species that are endemic to certain kinds of habitats or potentially rare. So the way that this kind of translates into our grasslands and our restorations, it starts me thinking, okay, so we have this richness comparison. Restorations has 3, field margins have 1, prairie remnants have 3. But if you start looking at what species make up those types of restorations and remnants, are they the same or are they different? Is it more characteristic of like an anthropogenic environment, or is it more characteristic of a prairie remnant environment? So in this hypothetical example, it's like, okay, we have 2 species that are similar, but then there's this one species in remnant that we didn't see, but then there's this other one that we didn't see anywhere else. So this is my way of saying it's not always clear cut. There's a lot of confusion, but there's not a ton of work that looks at this, though there's more coming all the time, asking, are restorations and remnants conserving the same types of species, not just the number of species and the abundance of species? And so this is an important question. So to kind of break this down, this idea that I'm exploring, it's really a question of this phenomena called biotic homogenization. So I tried to distill this into like a pretty simple series of graphics. And I use birds because everyone loves birds. All right, so if you have cornfields, and cornfields really are attractive to starlings, which maybe they are, and you also have other environments. You have wetlands and you have prairies, and they all have different species living in them, right? You have green herrings and bobolinks in these different kinds of environments. But then as you replace these other habitats with more corn, you really are just helping starlings. And then eventually your landscape becomes dominated by starlings. So that when you actually begin to put restorations in, are you going to be just attracting more starlings because that's the only thing left in the environment? Or will you attract something from a remnant? So that kind of formed the basis of my questions that I've been working on for my PhD dissertation, really trying to understand if the types of landscapes that we put prairie restorations, do they have an effect on the types of species we see and how homogenized or characteristic of a human habitat they are versus a more natural community? So this is a graphical abstract that kind of illustrates the types of things that I'm interested. I'm really interested in how our restorations affect bee communities and how both the agricultural landscapes that those restorations are in and the types of floral resources in those restorations both work together to influence these types of communities. So I'm going to show you a couple different projects that I've been working on. The first one is a project that I've been working on where I only looked at prairie restorations. And I worked really intensely with the Board of Water and Soil Resources here in Minnesota. Dan Shaw and John Vaz are really critical in helping me find sites. And we found like almost 100 different restorations that I considered for this. But at the end of the day, I picked out 16 sites kind of around these areas of Minnesota. And I picked these sites because they fell along this gradient of agricultural development around the sites. So I could try to ask what's going on in these prairie restorations. Our bee communities, do they look different if you look in these areas that are very high in ag content or very low in ag content and everywhere in between? So this is the experimental setup. We looked at these prairie restorations across the state with varying amounts of agricultural land surrounding them. And we wanted to ask the question, are prairie restorations and landscapes dominated by agriculture less diverse or more homogeneous than those in more diverse landscapes? So the homogeneous component is kind of getting at, are the communities more similar to each other and therefore more anthropogenically influenced, I guess you could say. So we actually published this work recently, and what we found was that the amount of agriculture surrounding a site didn't tend to affect the number of species we found. In fact, there was a slight positive effect that wasn't significant, but the floral resource richness really did influence it. And we even looked at the interaction and found that regardless of how much agriculture you have surrounding your restoration, what really the bee community diversity is responding to is floral richness. But like I said, we're not interested in more than just diversity. We're really interested in who makes up those different habitats. And what we found was that the composition in these low, medium, and high agricultural surroundings of restorations didn't really impact how different sites were. Like sites that were in high agricultural environments weren't more homogeneous to each other than those in low. So what this is essentially telling us is that don't be afraid to take those restorations and put them in high agricultural areas, as much as make sure that those seed mixes and the diversity are really cultivated, because that seems to be what really just amongst restorations bee communities are responding to. The community is relatively similar across the range of agricultural development, but the diversity is going up as you have more floral resources for them. Diversity, that is. So that kind of brings us to the next portion of what I've been talking about, is who is really in these restorations? Are we just conserving a more anthropogenic group of species, or are we conserving those species that are actually still in prairie remnants and things like that? So what is at the crux of that question is, what is our target group? Like, what are we trying to restore when we say we're trying to conserve bees in a prairie restoration? So, and I think this is like really telling, because I think people who really are interested in bees as opposed to other kinds of pollinators, we struggle to kind of like give a solid message about this, because monarchs, the Dakota skipper, regal fritillaries, they have such a simplified message about we need to plant, these certain kinds of plants like milkweed or violets. There's really lots of concrete actions we can take to restore populations of these individuals. But with bees, we've only just begun to understand who is declining, like Bombus finis, the rusty patch, or another Bombus terricola, another one that might be listed soon. So without better information, how do we start to figure out what is our target group? And I've kind of already hinted at this, but even the best understood bee fauna in the world, in Europe, we actually have no idea. Over half of the species, we just don't have enough data to understand who's at risk. And so you can imagine for North America, it's even worse. We have really not a ton of information about which species are declining. So this idea of like, what are prairie restorations trying to conserve about bee communities is important. And so, as I kind of hinted at earlier, without more information, we should be trying to conserve the types of species that you'd find in a prairie remnant, rather than just some general richness number or something to that effect. So to kind of get, and I'm gonna loop back to this detailed information thing, because I was hinting at looking at rare species, and hopefully I'll have time to talk about that. But to answer this question, well, let's start with the question. Is simply, are the bees present in these restorations similar to those in remnants? So the concept here is still the same. We're still really interested in how agricultural landscapes in floral communities affect bee communities, but now we're trying to understand if those two things influence how similar the bee communities in a restoration are to a remnant prairie's bee communities. So hopefully that's making sense. But so we did something similar as to the first study I mentioned. We had our gradient of different restorations along this agricultural development gradient. And then we selected a subset of these sites that we then paired with nearby remnant sites. And those remnants were from a variety of different organizations across Minnesota. So Becky Esser was there helping me find different sites, as well as like a whole host of people at Nature Conservancy and other groups. So I owe a lot to them for helping me kind of identify these locations and getting out there to do this work. So at the end of the day, we had an experimental setup that looked something like this. We had these restored sites across these different parts of the state, and each one was paired with a nearby remnant prairie that was ranked, to be pretty high quality by the DNR. So these are nice remnants kind of near these restorations, and these restorations have varying amounts of agricultural development around them. So this is the study that we kind of started with, and we started to look at some of the differences between these sites. So one of the things that is really well known, so this shouldn't be shocking to everyone, is that the plant community between restorations and remnants was very different. So one of the things that we wanted to kind of be checking was how similar are restorations and remnants in our system? Is that kind of tracking with what other research is finding in other states? And it seems pretty consistent. The restorations in our study there's more species in the remnants, for flowering species. I should be clear that like this is all about flowers. I know grasses are super important, but just humor me with the flowering thing. So the number of species in remnants is quite higher than restorations in general. And also that the composition of those species is quite different. So here we have that same type of graph again, where points that are closer are more similar. And so you have restorations kind of forming their own club over here. And then you have remnants forming their own club over here. You notice that like it looks like there's more spread, like remnants aren't super similar to each other even. There's like, here's this guy out there, like really different than the rest of his remnant friends. Whereas the restorations seem like they're a little bit closer together. So remnants are just very different florally from each other and from restorations. So that's pretty consistent. And, that jives somewhat with like what Megan was saying last time with restoration conservative and restoration aggressive species. Some species do really well in restorations and some are a little bit less, that takes a little bit more work to get them in. And I think this kind of reflects that. We have a lot of floral resources in these restorations. It's just they're different. So the first thing we wanted to check was, as the number of species, this kind of like this richness number, like, is that kind of jiving with what everyone else has been finding? And we found that it is. Restorations and remnants are actually pretty similar to each other in the number of species. So in this case, this isn't like a significant difference in a statistical sense, but restorations even are trending a little higher in terms of diversity than remnants for bees. But then when we started looking at what is the composition of those bee communities at these different sites, we started seeing that there was actually a significant difference with certain kinds of restorations really kind of grouping with themselves out here, and some other ones that looked a little bit more similar to restorations. So the bee communities were, in some cases, more similar to those in remnants, but in other cases, like these guys out here in La La Land, like they're not similar to anyone else in here. So we're starting to get this idea that maybe these communities are a little different. So we started to use our paired design to ask some questions. Mainly, does the amount of surrounding agriculture affect the bee community dissimilarity? So one thing to keep in mind about the bee community measure here, it's a metric from 0 to 1. So 0 meaning they are completely the same, and 1 meaning they're nothing in common. So this is kind of like a 0 to 1, like how similar are they sort of measure. So in this one, we found that the percent of agriculture around these restorations doesn't seem to have a significant impact on how similar these bee communities are to these remnants. It's just not a really big spread here on the y-axis. 0.475 to 0.575 isn't a huge amount of difference. So in this kind of paired setup where the remnants are pretty close by, within 10 kilometers, 10 to 15 kilometers, the amount of agriculture surrounding a site doesn't seem to impact if it's more or less similar to a remnant. We also looked at how dissimilar the pairs were in terms of their floral community. And here you can see the floral community is very different. Some of them are completely dissimilar. They have nothing in common with just a restoration or remnant that are literally separated by 10 kilometers, have nothing in common, which is kind of interesting. So even that floral, how similar those floral communities isn't 100% jiving with, like, why are these two types of communities looking different? So we decided to look at some other types of things going on within the bee community to try to pick out specific species or different kinds of qualities the bees might have that might cause them to be different between restorations and remnants. So the two things that I was really interested were these characteristics. The first one is tongue length. So all bees have these proboscis that they use for sucking up nectar. And the length of that tongue is really correlated to how efficiently they can forage on flowers of differing lengths. So you could imagine a bee with a really long tongue, like this bumblebee, might be a lot more efficient at foraging on flowers that have really long corollas, like maybe a legume of some kind, versus ones that have very short tongues that might be better at foraging on something like a sunflower, let's say. So we know that bee body size is really correlated to their tongue length. And so we're actually able to measure in all the bee sizes and correlate that to their tongue length and generate kind of a tongue length for every specimen we have. And then we were also really interested in this other idea of the specialized species. So bees actually have this they're like a lot of animals in that they have specializations too. So some types of butterflies will only live their life on one particular kind of host plant, and some bees will only collect certain kinds of pollen. And those species we call oligolectic. So they only really focus on a handful of species, usually closely related. On the right here, I have an example. This is a longhorn bee that will only collect pollen from asters. So sunflowers, gray-headed coneflowers tend to be its preferred hosts. And it might visit some other kinds of things, but you wouldn't usually find it collecting pollen from, say, bee balm or something like that. So they tend to have they're more specialized on their foraging for pollen. And we know that globally, not just with bees, though it's true for bees, but all animals that are specialized tend to be in some kind of decline. They're definitely a conservation concern, but they're also something that might be driven by some of these floral differences we saw between the restorations and remnants. These are both characteristics that maybe they correlate to some of, like, how are those plants different? Maybe this will elucidate some of those differences. So when we looked at tongue length, we found that, wow, that's the same. There is no difference in the mean tongue length of all the individuals that we found in remnants versus those in restorations. They're the same. So there's no evidence that the floral differences, like maybe there's more long flowered plants in restorations or remnants, driving differences in the bee community. That just doesn't seem to be the case. But what we did find was that there was a significant difference in the number of specialized species in remnants compared to restorations. So there was actually a higher proportion of species in remnants that were specialized compared to restorations. So this is pretty interesting, and maybe is helping us understand how the plant community is driving some of the differences between restorations and remnants. So one of the things that I then started to do was look for clues about who could be driving these specialized species differences between restorations and remnants. And one of the things that popped out immediately were the types of bees that specialize on the Amorphiae tribe of plants, being lead plant, purple prairie clover. They were just much poorly represented in restorations compared to remnants. So in this case, I only found purple prairie clover in restorations. I never found lead plant except in one case. And even then, I didn't tend to find more of these specialized species. And on the bottom here, I actually have a picture from Jessica, so there's my call out to you. There'll be maybe more, but there's many species that specialize on this group of flowers, this tribe, if you will. So these are just some of those examples. This is an Andrena, this is a Caletes, this is a Eucera, and they're usually pretty large charismatic species. And we just didn't find them in the same amounts in restorations. So could this be related to the fact that lead plant didn't seem to be in the restorations as much? It could be. But so this is a nice kind of place to focus on. If we're really interested in trying to make restorations look more like remnants, maybe we should try to focus on, well, can we get a morpha in there? Would that help? So there's like a next step portion is like, can we make the community more like a remnant community? So kind of like summing up this group of research is, are they similar to each other? Yes and no. There's definitely a significant difference, but it seems like sometimes they can be pretty similar. So are we conserving the right community? Kind of. But there does seem to be this gap where there's still more specialized species and remnants compared to restorations. And so this is only one case where there's actually a number of studies that have tried to answer some of these more nuanced questions about our restorations and remnants conserving similar species when it comes to bees. And I really tried to do a good job with that by pairing and really replicating across the landscape to answer this. So hopefully this will kind of help push forward, like what are the things that we can be doing to better make restorations conserving bees and more like remnants. So a couple of things that I did to kind of help push this idea forward was, and Megan talked about this in her talk last week, is that in conjunction with her and Gina Guerum at the DNR, as well as others in the lab, I designed, excuse me, a couple of handouts that were meant to kind of distill some of this information about floral resources that I found in these different restorations. So I won't go into it ad nauseum because I think Megan kind of already did that. But I do want to just highlight that I kind of broke down the types of species we were finding on these different plants and kind of like what does that mean a little bit. And you can get those on the Bee Lab website. And then I also did another handout that was meant to, okay, if we could pick some species to get better represented in restorations and that would help bees, what would those be? And so I tried to answer that question with this handout and really pick out species that have potential and would really fill certain gaps based on what we found in the data. So in this example here about earlier flowering plants, I point out that having things like penstemon and wood betony and veiny pea are all really nice early flowering resources for bumblebees. Because currently in the prairie restorations we studied, we only had these golden Alexanders, and they're great. They're a great plant, and they had lots of diversity, but they never had any bumblebees on them. So finding resources for those early foraging queens and things like that, these would be a really good way to plug that hole. And it sounded like last week people were saying they had lots of success with with wood betony, and I got really excited about that because that would be an amazing species to get more represented in restorations. And so it looks like I have time, so this is good. Or maybe I'll be under time, but I'm going to loop back to this idea about the detailed information on individual species conservation status. So the final question in my dissertation about prairie restorations, I really wanted to try to drill down to, are we conserving like the really at-risk species? You know, not just these really common anthropogenic species like Bombus impatiens or something, but really the rare species and the ones that seem to be declining. And one of the papers I highlighted attempted to quantify rare species. And it was a very challenging effort by collecting museum data and contemporary studies into one large data set that was kind of highly focused on the Northeast United States, because that example I used was like forest and urban and the agriculture, you know, is entirely focused on that ecoregion. But can we do that here for Minnesota or for other states in the prairie kind of belt? And so one of the things that there's questions. No, we're moving forward. One of the questions that I got really interested in was, can we actually achieve this for our state? And so I reached out to Jessica Peterson because she's been doing all this monitoring within the state to work with her and the DNR to assemble both the studies that our lab has conducted in both the DNR's collection efforts, along with other partners too. I should say that the data that we're pulling together involves people from Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as all sorts of institutions. We're trying to bring that together to really understand what are the rare and common species in our state. And we even have museum records from, you know, institutions across the country even. So we're really trying to combine and really get a really detailed picture through time and both contemporarily, what types of species are we finding and how frequently. So this data set spans our state and clearly other states around it, even though it's been highly focused on Minnesota. We have over 100,000 records of individuals, so it's pretty good. And we even have records going back to the early 1900s. And some of those records have floral visitation, so there's even the potential to learn something about the flowers that certain species are using and potentially through time. So one of the things I'm really interested in doing and I've started working on is let's use this data to try to define what is a rare species in our state. So rarity is kind of a tricky thing to quantify. You know, you could think about it in different ways. So one of them is frequency. Like if you go to a place, how often do you find something? You know, it's like across the state, something could be, you could find it all the time, but it may not be super abundant when you find it, but it's kind of always there maybe. And then there's this other example of abundance. So something could be really abundant, but you might not find it everywhere. One really good example from bees is that there's this species called Perdita purpallida, and it's one of those specialists on dahlia, and it seems to only be found in really sandy, duney habitats. But when you do find it, it's really abundant. But it's only in those really few types of sites where you get these sandy conditions and these flowering species together that you kind of find them. So there's a couple different dimensions of rarity here. It's kind of frequency, how often do you find them, and then their abundance. So if you were to start breaking this down into categories, you might have something that say on the far right here are our most common species. They're very frequently found, and they tend to be very high in abundance when you do find them. They're common. And then on the far top left here, you have our rarest species, ones that are really infrequently found. And then when you do find them, they're not very abundant either. So, and then there's all these different flavors, if you will, across the spectrum. But, you know, focusing kind of on these like rarest categories here would be a nice way of trying to understand what species might actually be in conservation need. And so that work is ongoing, and I think that it's 1:50, so that leaves some time for questions. That's perfect. So yeah, if anybody's interested in any of this work, I'm happy to answer questions and all that.
Great job, Ian. Like, really nice. You can hear my voice all the time. So it's
I could not hear your voice.
I can hear it like as an echo. Okay, so there were some questions in the chat and I want to make sure I cover them. If you did not type your name and your organization in the chat, if you can make sure to do that so we can keep track of who's here today and where you're joining from, that will really help us. We had some debate, maybe instigated by me, about whether or not people really love starlings, but then lots of good points about them definitely eating insects. So then Walt had a question: is the look of the remnants due to the plant species present and a season-wide flowering period in remnants? Restorations tend to be heavy to species that are easily harvested.
Yeah, great question. So in my specific case, my work didn't really begin until we saw flowering and restorations. So it's kind of like a way to standardize. Like it's kind of like standardizing and trying to be fair between restorations and remnants was like a key feature. I wasn't trying to make it, like, oh, I'm going to start early in remnants because there's lots of flowering like in mid-April. But then, so there's all this time I'm sampling remnants and restorations are getting left out. But that is 100% true. So my data does not reflect phenological differences really between the two habitats, though they do very much exist, like you say. I did try to get into that a little bit, and I didn't present any of that information here, but we actually did go out and try to sample off of some of these pairs earlier in the season when their flowering was beginning. And of course, that was the year that like there was a huge snowstorm in mid-April, and like it didn't melt until mid-May anyway. So it was that like, but it still, there was a lot of species that were flowering and you saw bees on them. And then in restorations, it was really golden alexanders that were the beginning, along with dandelions, of course, that were the beginning of the flowering season for that kind of habitat. So in the case for this work, yeah, it doesn't reflect those phenological differences, though that is definitely a part of it.
And then another one from Walt, and this is, Walt, are you trying to depress us? Are some species always going to be rare no matter what we do? That's a heavy one, Ian.
It's true. And some species only do well when they're rare. So that is an excellent point, because rarity is something that can be and is selected for through evolution. Some species, when they get too dense, all of a sudden their parasites and their pathogens are just activated and they can really decimate the population. But when they're rare and there's not really getting together, they don't pass, and they just are more productive, and they are able to produce more offspring. So there are a lot of cases where that is the truth, and it's good that they're rare. But the kind of concept here is more that rareness is correlated with their propensity to be in decline. So it's like, of course, you'll have some species that are always rare, and they'll probably always be rare. They were rare and before European arrival, and they'll be rare long after us, and maybe that's just the way they'll always be. Maybe we made them rare. There's a lot of different dimensions to that. Man, I hope we get there someday. That's like understanding all these different kinds of dimensions of like decline and rarity and how to assign them. But we're just so out here and like, are we losing species? I don't know. It's like we're still publishing a lot of like vague like richness declines papers, and so it's definitely we're still in that discovery phase even. Like the alarm bells have been ringing for a while about bee decline, but we're still trying to quantify it. Like we're still trying to understand it.
Okay, we have more questions for you. Good answer. This is very comprehensive. I'm proud of you. Oh, how does competition for floral resources impact bee populations? And there's a second part, but go ahead and answer that first part.
That is an ongoing and heated debate, even among scientists, about how competition, especially, because honeybees are the the one that everyone is really like, are honeybees impacting native species populations? So there's two versions of an answer to that. One is like the hemming hawing scientist that's like, well, the studies, there's a lot of flaws and we can't say for sure. And then there's the person that is following the precautionary principle and saying, even a little bit of evidence is a cause to be concerned. And I tend to, so let's go with that one. I think that we're still building evidence that things like honeybees can impact native bees. How they impact them and to what degree is still like an active area of research, but it's better to assume that there is impacts so that when we do have the ability to control that, like, for example, do we put bees on federal land? That's like a big debate, especially out west. Maybe we can apply the precautionary principle there as opposed to say like, we got to hate all honeybees. I definitely don't say that. They're an important part of our agricultural system, just like corn and soybeans are. Like I hope I don't come off as like anti-agriculture in that sense, because there's no way we have to coexist with them, essentially. Just like, landscape simplification, it's all part of the landscape. So trying to coexist with honeybees, I think, is an ongoing, like, how do we do it, and where can we limit exposure, and how can we coexist when possible? Those are all like really important questions. And I could go on, and I would be really interested in other people's thoughts too, but that's my like simplified version of that.
Ian, have you heard anything about honeybees perhaps preferring to forage on non-native species that would be native in their normal range? So things like red clover or other things like that. And so maybe the competition factor is somewhat reduced because when given a choice, they would prefer a different floral resource?
So I'll try to answer that, but I'll put a caveat on that my answer is kind of guided by my interpretation of a couple studies plus my own anecdotal experience. So I don't want to build this as like the comprehensive response, but from my experience in a couple papers, it does seem like honeybees have some kind of preference for non-native species. So one of those studies is coming from North Dakota, where they were finding, where they looked at the honeybee colonies themselves, not like out looking at plants. They were disproportionately always visiting sweet clover. They love sweet clover. It's crack to them. And so when they were, and there was another student in Marla Spivak's lab at the Bee Lab that she put honeybee colonies at the Bellwin Conservancy, a restoration remnant kind of complex near the Twin Cities. And she never found any honeybees inside the remnants or restorations. They were all dancing to these floral resources that were outside the preserve, like on roadsides and stuff. And and when she was able to verify them, they were like things like sweet clover. But with that being said, so there's some pretty good evidence that they preferentially will forage on some of these non-native, like especially legumes like sweet clover. But then from my own experience, I see all sorts of situations where people will say things like, oh, honeybees don't visit bee balm because the flowers are too long. Their tongues can't get to all the nectar. And that's not true. I saw tons of honeybees visiting bee balm. I also saw tons of honeybees visiting prairie clover. And it was very idiosyncratic. It was, some sites had, it seemed, a lot of influence of honeybees, some had none at all. And it probably was related to who had hives and how many. So it's really tough to like kind of just like, yeah, I had some experiences. Is that the pattern? I don't know. I think that there is, and I think it's a really astute observation that maybe a lot of the perceived competition is actually avoided because they're visiting these weedy non-natives. But yeah, like I don't think I'm like 100% qualified to say that is going to prevent competition with native species on more native plants, because they still use those native plants too, the honeybees, I mean. So right. I hope that is close enough answer.
You did. You answered it very well. We have a few more questions, and I'm just going to pause here for a minute. We are right at 2:00, which is the scheduled end of the webinar. Just like last week, we are going to hang out here as long as you have questions. It is recorded, so if you need to go, if you need a break, if you just need to get up and stretch, if you need to go outside and see if you have any like dig a hole and see if there's a bumblebee queen in your yard, don't do that. But like if you just need to go, that's absolutely fine. We will still be
here.
You
do that, tell me.
Yeah, you do that. Ian can't go. He's going to be here for just a little bit longer. So we're going to keep answering questions. And I am going to go ahead, since some folks are having to jet off, I am just going to put into the chat so that you can grab that before you leave, the place where the webinar recording is going to go. So underneath the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative website, there's a nice little What We Do tab, and underneath that, there's a nice handy webinar tab. And so you can just bookmark that and keep it forever, because that's where this will be recorded. So we have a few more questions for you, Ian. You are not off the hook. I just wanted to make sure that sometimes people do the Midwest nice thing where they're like, I can't leave because they're still talking, but I really gotta go. Like, if you have to go, please do that. We respect your time. We're just happy to sit here too and keep talking bees with those who are able. So let's see. How you mentioned a few early season forbs to include in restorations. Early season forbs can be difficult to find and very expensive. Troy, you just need to get out there and start posting. What is this complaining question here? No, his real question was, do you have any suggestions for native shrub species that we could consider to try to get some of that early flowering diversity into our plantings?
Yeah, so my general naturalist instinct is that you tend to see a lot of native shrubs in the northwestern prairies, and in the southwestern prairies you tend not to see as many, but people can totally correct me if I'm wrong. But what my experience has been is that especially up in the northwest, I saw lots of things like field willow in the prairie remnants, like Salix humilis, and different Cornus, especially Cornus sericius, were there, and they are excellent species for bees. Maybe even keystone. So Salix it attracts a lot of different species, and it will also attract a very large diversity of specialized species. There is a lot of individuals individual species don't specialize in willow, but they're also a hit with bumblebee queens and things like that. And I have an anecdote about that. When I was at Felton Prairie, we were looking at the pasque flowers. There's hundreds of them there. And we spent like an hour just going through these pasque flowers, and we found like no bees on them. But then we just looked at the pussy willow in the depression next to it, and it was nuts. It was like hundreds of individuals on the willow. So it is great. And the same deal with the dogwoods. They have a lot of specialists. They're very attractive. 100%. Like if it makes sense for your region and for you, like that is an excellent. Those are the two that I noticed the most when I was out there, as being really big magnets. And if you start thinking about like more forested areas and things like that, there's definitely resources out there. You start thinking about viburnums, things like that. But I've been mostly prairie focused. And and prunus, man, I see a lot of things on prunus when it's in bloom, especially bumblebees. There was a couple locations where that was the case. So yeah, those are all great.
I love that you mentioned willow, because a lot of times I see us cutting willow off of some of our sites, and I'm always thinking, no, like that's the only thing you're gonna have blooming early for some of those early emerging bumblebees. They need this to be out
how
there.
does it respond to fire? Someone probably knows better than me. I always assume that field willow, it's like it's there, it's kind of short, like maybe it's surviving those fire events.
When it gets big enough, yeah, you definitely would have to cut it out. It's also likes to make more of itself, so it can become a problem. It's always about finding balance, right? It can be a tricky thing to do, but I would also encourage folks to consider incorporating a transition or savanna habitat into your restoration site plans. So we often try to think, I think just because it's easier for people, right? So we think like, oh, I have a prairie restoration here, or I have a woodland here. Well, there's lots of transition in between habitat too that could provide some really nice additions to your prairie, and savanna would have historically existed in this prairie landscape. So it's really nice. I'm just doing a little promotion here for the transitional habitats.
And oak pollen is actually collected pretty abundantly by bees. It's high in protein. It doesn't have like those same specialized relationships as like cornus or salix, but it's definitely known as something that a lot of bees visit.
Nice. All right, just a note here that sometimes when we cut those willows, they're not treated so that they can regenerate and provide a nice floral resource. So a good way to think about managing the landscape that way. Any other questions or comments? I don't see any hands raised. If I'm missing you, please feel free to unmute and be like, hey, you missed me. You don't have to say it mean. You could say it nice. Also had 17 Hershey's Kisses while you were talking, Ian, so great job.
Is that like a measure of success? Like,
yes.
It's like, it wasn't 20, so.
I wanted to show you, like, so here's the cup, and then here's what happened. That's just for you. All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I am going to stop the recording. Ian, I'm going to give you a round of applause.
Thank you.
Look at that. Look at it going around. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day to learn more about pollinators. You can definitely, Ian's going to type his email address into the chat in case you have some direct questions for him. So that way you know how to contact him. Soon he's going to be, you know, a big deal scientist with a full-time job. He just shakes his head. And Ian, if you want to put the link in there to your paper as well that you just published, you can also find it on Google Scholar by typing in Ian Lane. But it's a really, really well done paper. Very, very nice job. That's summarizing a lot of what he presented here today, or at least the early first part of what he presented here today.
Yeah. What was the things you wanted me to put? My email?
Your email address, just in case folks want to connect with you. I know now I should have done it for you. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. And then what was the other thing?
If you have a link to your paper that you could pop into the chat just so folks can grab it as they're heading out here.
Of course. Yeah.
Great job. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.
And if there's a paywall, just let me know and I can send you the real one.